We examine the oil industry following the Second World War and how the global corporations or majors who controlled the industry at that time were to be challenged by the countries whose oil they had exploited. Before the war, the United States had become the biggest producer, consumer and exporter of oil, and with no need for redevelopment following the war, its consumer society continued to flourish freely. In 1947, the United States owned around 80% of all the world's vehicles, and although the country continued to be an oil industry leader, American analysts understood that that position was about to change.
It became clear that the demand for oil around the world was greater than the U.S. could supply. Particularly after World War II, Europe rebuilt its economies around oil, as did Japan, and in that same period, American consumption skyrocketed. In recognition of this growing demand and in the common sense observation that foreign oil was to be found in much larger fields and much less expensive to produce, the American and British companies intensified their quest around the world for new sources of petroleum.
En 1945, il y a eu un rapport du département d'État américain sur justement le pétrole et surtout le pétrole du Moyen-Orient. C'était au moment où les compagnies pétrolières avaient fait de grandes découvertes, avaient commencé à réaliser que le Moyen-Orient est très riche en pétrole, alors que jusque-là, les États-Unis et la Russie étaient les grands pays producteurs de pétrole. Alors ce document, ce rapport du département d'État conclut en disant le contrôle du pétrole du Moyen-Orient est une source prodigieuse de pouvoir politique et de puissance économique. Citation. Ça n'a pas changé depuis.
As early as February 1945, this US political theory was to be realized, and it was to mark the fate of the world for decades to come. It was whilst returning from the post-war Yalta conference between Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin that Roosevelt arranged a secret meeting with Ibn Saud, first monarch of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He told Ibn Saud that the United States would guarantee Saudi Arabia's security against external and internal attack in return for privileged access to Saudi oil. And so the Oil for Security Agreement was signed, and what was to become known as the American Umbrella was conceived. In the shadow of the industrial wars of the modern world, the relationship seemed somewhat paradoxical, since it was only around 20 years earlier that Ibn Saud had united the archaic feudal tribes of the region under Islam and conquered Mecca to create the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There is an anecdote from the 1920s that tells of a New Zealand mining engineer, Major Frank Holmes, who wandered the deserts of the region in search of a very rare specimen of black butterfly, a poetic metaphor for the wealth the Saudi black gold would come to represent, and which he was the first to sense. He contacted the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. They sent a team of geologists into the field, but as they were only used to the Iranian oil model, they could not imagine that the clues they were looking for might be hidden beneath the walls of sand all around them. The report the engineers wrote was negative, and so Anglo-Persian gave up the project, unaware just how close they came to the most incredible treasure in oil's history. The Americans, with perhaps greater vision than the British, were to make this treasure their own. In 1933, Standard Oil of California, SoCal, later to become Chevron, led the way. They made a deal with Ibn Saud, who gave them a 1 million square meter concession in the eastern zone of his realm for £30,000 in gold coins. In 1933, 2 geologists and an interpreter crossed the desert in a Ford motor car, escorted by a dozen Bedouins. The first years proved disappointing, but at the end of the 1930s, promising discoveries were made and celebrated with great pomp. This marked the beginning of the Saudi oil adventure. Ten years later, at the beginning of the 1950s, it was to experience its first major success in the region of Ghawar, where several oil fields, all belonging to a single 200-kilometer-long field, were discovered. This enormous stain of oil with a surface area of 2,250 square kilometers, still the largest found today, led geologists to say that Saudi Arabia was floating on a sea of oil. SOCAL couldn't handle such a quantity alone and joined forces with 3 other majors, Texaco, the Standard Oil Company of New York, later to become Mobil, and the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, later to become Exxon. And so the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, was born, a gigantic, entirely American consortium. Distracted by their huge success in the region, the majors failed to appreciate the strength of nationalist feelings that were growing amongst its people.
À partir des années 50, et parallèlement donc au développement du sentiment nationaliste dans les pays du Moyen-Orient, prise de conscience du fait que, bon, ils sortaient un peu de l'ère coloniale, après avoir aussi échappé à l'emprise de l'Empire ottoman pendant 5 siècles, petit à petit, il y avait, en fait, disons, une certaine recherche identitaire, de qui nous sommes, qu'est-ce que nous faisons, etc. Et il y a eu ce développement du nationalisme arabe, représenté par le Parti Baas, ensuite par Nasser, évidemment, et parallèlement aussi à des courants politiques très puissants de socialisme, de parfois marxisme, et puis plus récemment de fondamentalisme, et malheureusement aussi tout dernièrement de terrorisme. Et grâce en grande partie à ce courant nationaliste qu'il y a eu la prise de conscience, disons, d'un nationalisme pétrolier. C'est-à-dire ces pays se sont rendus compte qu'ils ont été en quelque sorte bernés par ce qu'on appelle les accords de concession signés entre la Première et la Deuxième Guerre mondiale.
But it was a non-Arab country, Venezuela, that was to play an important role in the awakening of oil nationalism. Along with Mexico, it is one of the oldest oil-producing countries in Latin America. Back in the 1910s, despite the hostile peoples, nature and climate, the Anglo-American majors, with Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil at the fore, sent their prospectors there to look for zones rich in oil. In the 1920s, after a slow start, new discoveries were made one after another, especially in the basin of Maracaibo. Corrupt and bloody oil caudillos, who were like puppets in the hands of the majors, followed in the wake of this success, a situation that would continue after World War II and the fall of General Marcos Jiménez.